Hi, this is Anne Filippi, founder of the New Health Club. If you want to know about psychedelics as new mental health tools, you came to the right place. I talk to innovators, thought leaders, and disruptors, creating the future of mental health and mental wellness. And we think that the future is already here. Hi, and welcome to a new episode of the New Health Club show. My guest today is Dr. Dave Rabin. Together with Molly Maloof, Dr. Rabin is hosting the Psychedelic News Hour on Clubhouse at 11:30 PST every Friday. This is also where I heard about Dr. Rabin first, and I was really impressed by the guests and the following the show has. Also, the show became a really important source for information and destigmatization of psychedelics, and that very fast. Dave Rabin is an MD, PhD, a neuroscientist, board-certified psychiatrist, health tech entrepreneur and inventor who has been studying the impact of chronic stress in humans for nearly 15 years, particularly non-invasive therapies for treatment-resistant illnesses like PTSD. He's the co-founder and chief innovation officer at Apollo Neuroscience and the co-founder and executive director of the Board of Medicine. In addition to his clinical psychiatry practice, Dr. Rabin is currently conducting research on the epigenetic regulation of trauma responses and recovery to elucidate the mechanism of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy and the neurobiology of belief. He is a practitioner of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, KAP, and is trained in MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. We talk about listeners on Clubhouse that call in high and how to give them a little integration therapy on air. We talk about why epigenetic trauma is such a specific thing, hardly explored, and now really a big topic in the psychedelic context. We talk benefits of ketamine therapy done at home, and of course, we talk about Dr. Rabin's company, Apollo. Apollo Neuroscience was born from research at the University of Pittsburgh. Dave Rabin and Greg Siegel, PhD, worked together at the program in cognitive affective neuroscience to develop and scientifically prove out the Apollo technology, and discovered that certain combinations of low-frequency inaudible sound waves, vibration that you can't feel but can't hear, can safely and reliably change how we feel through our sense of touch, and that we can measure those physiological changes in near real time. Think of Apollo as a smart bracelet that you can wear around your wrist or ankle and works to give you stress-reducing buzzes in times of need. It syncs to the brand's app so you can control its touch therapy functions from your phone. I used Apollo often during the pandemic last year, and I fell asleep much easier with it, so I can highly recommend it. Apollo calms your nervous system down in a gentle way, but very effective way. And since you're part of our really appreciated New Health Club community, you get 10% discount on the order of Apollo right now for the next 14 days. Just head over to www.apolloneuro.com and put in the promo code NEWHEALTH10. I repeat, just head over to apolloneuro.com and put in the promo code NEWHEALTH10. Please keep us posted how you like the device and how you use it also. All right, and now over to Dr. Dave Rabin. Welcome, Dave Rabin, on the show. And I know you could say, besides that you're an MD and PhD, you're also one of the biggest Clubhouse stars at the moment.
Oh, thank you.
At least this is how I got to know of you, because you host, together with Molly Maloof, you host the Psychedelic Hour, right? And you're also the founder of the Psychedelic Clubhouse, which when Clubhouse landed in Europe or in Germany a couple of months ago, this was immediately one of the biggest, let's say, attractions in your show, but also like the whole existence and presence of psychedelics suddenly in the Clubhouse field. So how did this actually happen that you became basically, let's say, I mean, it's kind of impossible, but the face of the Psychedelic Clubhouse?
Oh, well, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it, Anne. It's a pleasure. And it's been good to have you as part of the Psychedelic Clubhouse group, of course. Okay. The short answer is that There's just been a lot of misinformation and poor understanding about psychedelic medicines and how they work, and psychedelic states more generally, what they mean, how to access them with or without medicines, how to use the medicines properly, safely, in a respectful way to minimize harm. And we saw this as clinicians. Dr. Molly Maloof is also a physician, and we saw this in the community at large, particularly in the Silicon Valley investor community, which is actually in large part where Clubhouse came from, or was, sort of boosted off into the world in that group. And so we, as soon as we got the opportunity to beta test Clubhouse in the early days, this is going back to July of 2020, we realized that this was a huge opportunity to educate. Right. And being physicians, we're also educators, even though that may not be always a huge part of a doctor's work. But, we see it as a responsibility to educate. And so the psychedelic Clubhouse became an opportunity for people to have these conversations that were just not being had anywhere else. And Clubhouse was a really incredible medium, as one of the first of its kind in the conversational manner that it creates, to be able to have these open dialogues of communication about psychedelic states and psychedelic medicines and things that are otherwise considered taboo in the medical community, and to share that information with the community at large.
Okay. But I mean, so I feel like it developed very fast, right? I mean, you have at this point, I just looked it up, 28,000 followers. And I mean, Clubhouse doesn't exist that long, right? I mean, it's not like Facebook or Instagram. So, and it feels like you were one of the people who really introduced the topic also to a very big audience, or you could almost say to a mainstream audience. So, and what do you think is especially important to, let's say, introduce a topic like that to a big audience, which you guys obviously are doing very well. And it's I mean, I remember the first shows when I listened to it, there was still confinement. It was dark. You couldn't go anywhere. And I was like, oh, tonight is the psychedelic hours on. I'm not going to go anywhere. And it was I mean, a little bit like a Saturday night evening show when you were a child, where there were 3 shows on television, and then you waited for these shows. So what do you think was, I'm not going to say the charm, but what do you think people obviously engaged in this very fast?
So I think there's a couple reasons. I think, the first of which is, again, this was at the time that the Psychedelic News Hour came out, which was in July of 2020. There were no other opportunities that were out there to have a voice dialogue, right? A spoken dialogue, not only about psychedelic experiences, but also with experts in the field, right? Mm-hmm. People who are practitioners like us, people who conduct research in the psychedelic space like we do, and who can present an unbiased evidence-based approach, or as unbiased as can be evidence-based approach that is, sharing newsworthy content with the community that is not accessible elsewhere, and having discussions that we facilitate that are not accessible elsewhere. And I think that, because of the timing of when that happened, it generated a very quick following, because people realized the uniqueness of the experience that is the Psychedelic News Hour. And I really appreciate how much you enjoyed it as well. And thank you for your kind words. And I think the other part of it is that because of COVID, right, there is, and because the isolation required for public health, particularly in 2020, there was a certain desire from in all of us that was very high in a lot of respects for that sense of community that was lacking, right? And so Clubhouse as an app filled a very specific niche in that way, where people started gravitating to it because they got a sense of community that they weren't getting in their day-to-day lives, because they were isolated or quarantined for a large part of the year. Yeah. And then having a place like the Psychedelic Clubhouse and the Psychedelic News Hour became a really interesting part of that bigger picture. And now we have, I think, over 60,000 followers in the Psychedelic Clubhouse itself, of people who are, to one extent or another, actively engaged in our content. And I think the other part of it is, as you said, just to wrap it up, to answer your question, the idea of radio shows like you were talking about back in the day is something that was really appealing, right? Because even if you don't choose to participate, you have the opportunity in a lot of respects to call in and participate and interact with the people who are on the show and leading the show. And that's overwhelmingly been lost in the podcast and the news media TV world. Nobody calls into a TV show most of the time, right? Nobody calls into a podcast most of the time. It's very much audience participatory. And so we saw that as an opportunity to really engage the audience and bring together a conversation that wasn't just us, right? It was us with people from the community who were expressing their views and their interests and, what drives them into this movement. And so that's, I think, altogether how this really took off the way it did.
No, absolutely. And I think I feel like there were way more conversations, at least in Germany around that time. But we had a couple of times, if it came to psychedelics or, for New Health Club shows, we had often the case that people called in who were actually high. And first of all, you really didn't know. And they were like, yeah, I think I'm going. And then suddenly you were like, oh, no, I'm fucked. It's kind of, what can I say to bring this person now to either ask a real question? So, and it was sometimes very difficult to, you don't want to kick out people. Some people were very rude, strict, and were cutting people off. But so what was your best experience so far with these kind of interventions in the show?
That's a good question. Mm-hmm. I think we haven't had that many people come up and participate when they're under the influence of a substance, but we have had some. And I think, most of them, when they come up, it's always an interesting interaction. And I think for most of the people who come up, we kind of, they're very complimentary for one. Most of them are in a very good place in their minds, and they're really enjoying the conversation first off. And so they come up and they just, they give a lot of positive feedback and talk about how it's been benefiting them to hear this kind of stuff being talked about. And that's really always encouraging. And I think we just generally try to, mainly because being on a phone or being actively engaged in a conversation takes away from that internal experience of being on a psychedelic medicine and doing psychedelic medicine based healing work or facilitated healing work. So we try to use, in some ways, the therapeutic approach that we use in the treatment when we're actually working with a patient, which is called a non-directive approach. So we kind of gently guide the person to recognize where their head's at, and then that they'd probably be better off hanging out and just turning their phone off and enjoying the experience and taking it in for what it is, rather than talking about it or distracting themselves from it in the way that they might be with their phone. So this is the same thing that we do in therapy as well, right? It's when people get distracted, they want to talk about something else. They want to think about something that's not a personal thing. Yeah. They get distracted by something that's going on in the room or in the environment. We always just try to gently nudge them sort of back inside themselves and kind of into a self-reflective state.
That's actually good advice for any high customers coming in next time. Let's switch to your really impressive work that you're also doing. So, and I think, speaking of therapy, that we was just the therapy on Clubhouse, one of your topics, I feel, I read a lot about you, is basically the treatment of PTSD, right? And any kind of stress-related things that we can talk about later about Apollo, of course. But I feel like this topic of, let's call it post-COVID, although we're still in the middle of COVID, PTSD, which was a topic, I feel like a couple of months ago, maybe only on LinkedIn, where people were like, well, there will be, the mental health crisis will be kind of tripled or quadrupled, and there will be also like post-COVID PTSD. And I feel like with a lot of people, maybe the whole world, I don't know, is kind of suffering from this right now, in terms of there's an underlying tension, an underlying stress factor? What is it going to be next year? Do we need a booster? Can we get the booster? And what does it mean? Like all these kind of almost like a very subtle new layer of stress elements is coming to the daily life. And my question would be, so, I mean, is there, or the first question would be, is there anything that you detect that is kind of showing you this, that people are kind of engaging even more in kind of stressful or stressed out behaviors? Is this something that you witness in your practice?
For sure. And I think that while stress and the level of it in the prior to the pandemic, prior to 2020 may have been deniable for most people, I think the pandemic and the isolation really brought forth the undeniability of the stress that we're all facing because of the demands of modern life, right? Yeah. And it's not to say that it's any one individual's fault. It's not, right? It's the idea that we are just overstimulated and overwhelmed by a whole lot of modern technology and sensory input, and also a lot of responsibilities that we didn't have even 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, right? The idea that you now go to work, many people start work when they pick up their phones in the morning before they even get to the office. Yeah. Right. And then they get to the office and then they work, assuming you work in an office still, and then you're working the whole day, and then you come back and your day does not necessarily end when you leave, because you can still get pinged on your mobile device, and you're still exposed to screens, and you're still exposed to news inputs, and you're still exposed to people talking about the news and to all the other responsibilities that go along with being a human being. And so that is, different in a lot of ways than what we used to face. And what it does is it puts us into a state of what we call a sympathetic dominant state, or a state of sort of chronic stress. And by sympathetic, I mean the sympathetic nervous system, which is that fight, flight, or freeze response nervous system that is evolved in all mammals and most animals to turn on when we perceive threat from the environment. And it's supposed to turn on with survival threat, not emails, not our kids screaming, not responsibilities. It's, not somebody looking at us funny in a meeting. It's supposed to turn on in response to lack of food, water, air, shelter, or potentially the lack of even acceptance by our community, right? Those are the kinds of things that can turn on the stress response and are evolved to turn on the stress response. But when that stress response is turned on all the time, all of our available resources in our bodies, like the blood, the oxygen, et cetera, are going to our heart, our lungs, our motor cortex of our brains, our fear center of our brains, and the part of our bodies and our brains that are supposed to get us out of a stressful, survival threatening situation, which is not, thankfully, most situations that most of us are facing on a daily basis are not actual survival threat situations. And that is taking away resources on a continuous basis from our recovery system, which is called the parasympathetic nervous system, or the rest and digest nervous system, that is responsible for, activating a response to safety and allocating resources to everything that our bodies do to recover. So sleep, regulating metabolism, emotions, empathy, digestion, reproduction, immunity, and our ability to fight off illness. All of these things are only able to get resources and energy devoted to them when we feel safe. So when we haven't been taught safety techniques to do when we're young, like deep breathing, meditation, mindfulness, yoga, and soothing touch or soothing music, or how to use any of these other tools, then we have an overabundance of threatening or potentially threatening stimuli that is unbalanced. And practicing these safety techniques, whether it's deep breathing or soothing touch or meditation or yoga or using Apollo or any of the other things we've talked about, over time can help to restore that balance.
Mm-hmm. And maybe you can explain, I mean, now that we're just already talking about it, so you created Apollo, which I used, and it's a very interesting feeling. So I'm between the Aura Ring and Apollo the whole time. This is my life now, basically. But I mean, it's a very interesting tool that where you think these little kind of hits against my ankle, what is it supposed to do? but it has a very interesting influence on you. Maybe you can just explain to our listeners what Apollo actually is, that you co-created, right?
Sure. Yeah. Apollo is a technology that came out of my research at the University of Pittsburgh on studying how to help people who have too much chronic stress, because we know that stress makes performance worse, physical and mental performance. So if we could, and we know that deep breathing and meditation and biofeedback and float tanks and all of these techniques boost performance and have significant performance outcomes. And this is particularly well known in the athletic literature, which is very interesting, that we know that there was a large amount of evidence that if you provide these balancing parasympathetic recovery, safety-based stimuli to the body, that you could restore balance in the autonomic nervous system, the stress response system, and recovery response system, and then help people reach a higher level of cognitive performance and functioning, and potentially physical performance and functioning. And so with that in mind, with the main idea of trying to help our patients with post-traumatic stress disorder, many of whom were veterans, the idea who also have this chronic stress, but to an extreme, we basically tried to tap into the ability to activate that nervous system with soothing touch through the pathway of soothing touch in the skin, which is basically taking the benefits of music that we all know, and touch that we all know to exist in our lives, where you can walk into a room or turn on the radio and you hear your favorite song playing, and it's just like you're in the moment with that song, and you're not thinking about all the crazy other crap that happened to you during the day. You're just in the moment. And music has such an incredible ability to shift our energy and mood states up or down or in all across different spectrums, and we don't even really think about it. And it's the same with touch. So thinking about that, we said, okay, well, you can't listen to music all the time, and there's lots of different musical interventions out there. What if we took the patterns and rhythms that we understood to be important for music and then composed sound waves that were for the skin, touch receptors instead of the ears, that could help to provide the similar benefits of music and soothing touch via the skin, rather than having to monopolize your ears, so that you can use it during a talk, or you can use it when you're socializing with friends, or when you're being intimate with a partner, or when you're need to focus and do work for an extended period of time, and it's not distracting and it doesn't take you out of the moment. It actually helps you to be more present by centering your mind back in your body, similar to the way getting a hug from a loved one or somebody you like holding your hand, or taking a deep breath would do.
Mm-hmm. So that means you can also, you can order it and just like connect it to an app on your phone, and then you can choose also, do you use it I use it always before I go to sleep, or then in the morning to wake up. So you have like the whole scenario for a whole day for what you can use it, right? So to wake up or to wind down, basically.
Right. And that I think is to give you the idea. This is what Apollo looks like on the wrist. It has these two buttons that you can use to control it without your phone. And the idea being that, Apollo is not a tracker, right? We have enough devices that track us. What we wanted to do was use a bottom-up learning strategy, where instead of telling somebody something, which is top down, and then having them follow instructions to achieve an outcome, which only works at best 50% of the time, even if it's your doctor telling you to do it, and the reason for that is because when we're stressed, change is automatically harder. Our bodies and our minds oppose change and newness when we're stressed, because it triggers our fear response, because it's unfamiliar and it's new and it's uncertain. By calming the body, it allows us to get into a centered state where we feel calm enough to embrace change, right? And to embrace new opportunities that could potentially be better than what we've been doing before. So by using Apollo, you can, like music, turn your send faster, more intense vibrations to the body, like energy and wake up, which give you energy and help you to, get motivated to go about your day, similar to caffeine, but you can turn it on and off as you wish, through things like social and open, which is great for socializing when you're tired, or giving presentations or meetings, or being creative and doing creative work, to clear and focused, which is for intense, sustained focus, which is one of the modes that I use for public speaking a lot of the time. and doing intense deep work, and then rebuild and recover, which is the post-stress physical, mental, or emotional to rapidly calm the body down. And then meditation, mindfulness, which helps to improve access to meditative states, but also induces sort of a calm flow state that's great for a lot of people for aches and pains, all the way down through the most calming of the Apollo vibrations, which are relax and unwind, which is great for deep relaxation before bed and just calming the body into a more safe, sort of wound down, slower thinking state so that you can more easily transition into sleep, which is when you can use the sleep and renew, which really helps you fall asleep helps people fall asleep more quickly and access deeper, more restorative sleep more easily, which is really interesting. And now we actually have studies in the real world with thousands of people that using other wearable technology has shown us that this is in fact the effect that we were seeing in the lab is seen in the real world as well, where people are having improved cardiovascular fitness metrics from using Apollo, improved deep sleep and REM sleep from using Apollo, and total sleep over time, which is really exciting because it shows that we're actually reconditioning the body over time to function at a higher level and get a better, much more significant amount of recovery.
Yeah, I mean, it feels very interesting shortly before sleep. You also, coming back to our favorite topic, psychedelics, you're also a psychedelic therapist, and you also work with ketamine. And I found very interesting, which I read in an interview that you gave, how ketamine therapy could, or is already triggered because of COVID, already used in combination with telemedicine, which is for a lot of people, I mean, especially in Europe, still like a very strange idea that you're at home, let's say home alone, and then you take your ketamine and basically probably you meet your therapist over Zoom or over a telemedicine variation, and he or she guides you through the trip. So I assume that you have a couple of experiences, especially because there was a long time last year when you couldn't go into any practice, right? So maybe you can talk a little bit about how this looked like and how your experience was with that kind of very new idea for most people.
Sure. And just so that everybody knows who is unfamiliar with ketamine is it's probably when you think about on large scale, it's the only legal psychedelic medicine that is available in every state of the United States and almost every country of the world, because of its utility and legality as an anesthetic agent, which it's been used for at much higher doses than it's used for psychotherapy, but it's been used as an anesthetic for probably close to 70 years. And so it's been very well studied, and its side effect and risk profile are very well understood. And so it also provides a very interesting psychedelic experience that doesn't require very high doses and is also very short acting, right? So it only lasts about, in total, in terms of the peak experience, it's only about an hour and a half in duration. And then there's a little bit of a time afterwards when people start to feel like they're coming back into their bodies and they're feeling more centered but very much consciously aware and sort of, coming back into themselves. So it's very safe and it's very easy to use, respectively in a clinical setting in the office. It also lends itself very well to telemedicine because you can administer it especially in the US, and I'm not sure about in other countries, but there are pharmacies in the US that make low-dose ketamine in oral lozenges and in nasal sprays. That's very inexpensive because, the most basic form of pharmaceutical-grade ketamine is off patent. And so you can get custom compounding pharmacies in the US to make these very lower dose administration forms like oral lozenges or troches and nasal sprays. We actually entirely use the oral lozenge form that dissolves in your mouth. At low doses, which are basically what we call the minimum effective dose to get a psychedelic or significant psychoactive effect, we see dramatically transformative experiences in people in conjunction with psychotherapy, of course, which we do usually one or several sessions before to prep people before they go into the ketamine experience. And then we do sit with them on Zoom, and we for their first and sometimes second or third experience, but we basically focus on teaching them how to use the medicine on their own and really empowering them to do so. And then working with us in between sessions more than during, because during you're really in it, right? And you're not that, most people aren't that communicative, but it's the before and after where there's a wealth of information that becomes available to us to work with and to help what we call integrate that learnings of that ketamine experience into their day-to-day practice. And so that is incredible because it improves access to care. It helps people get access to ketamine at home, which is really exciting. And it helps people who would normally not be able to make it to a clinic or not be able to make it to a clinic where they get the medicine and psychotherapy from the same, providers, which is pretty uncommon actually in the US. Usually it's just medicine and then you have to have a separate therapist. And so having that all in one that you can access from the comfort of your home is really, really convenient for people. And it really makes it easier in general to just access high quality mental health care, which is really exciting.
So that means you get how do you call it? The one that you can take orally?
The lozenge.
Lozenge, yeah. So you take it, you're at home, let's say you're on your couch. So you take it a couple of minutes later. I mean, I just experienced the IV version, which is like, so you're out in a very short time. So then you're on your, let's say, couch or bed. So let's say you start the trip, let's call it. And that is like up to an hour, right? I mean, 1 hour and a half, you said. So, and then do you talk to let's say the online therapist, like straight afterwards, or how does it work?
Yeah, so we usually have, and this is related to the protocol that I was trained under, which is Dr. Phil Wolfson's protocol, who's one of the founders and leading psychiatrists in the ketamine-assisted psychotherapy space, who founded the Ketamine Research Foundation, which I highly recommend everyone look up who's interested in learning more about this tool. But the way we do it is the lozenges dissolve in your mouth and they absorb through your mouth. Ketamine is a very interesting chemical structure in that it has to be, the gut digests it, most of it almost immediately when you swallow it. So if you swallow 100 milligrams of ketamine, then you probably will only absorb about 10 milligrams of it. So that's about 10%. If you swish the ketamine in your mouth, the lozenges, for 12 to 15 minutes, then you absorb closer to 25 to 30%. And so, that allows us to figure out roughly how long you need to swish, what dose of ketamine you swish for 12 to 15 minutes, and then you swallow whatever medicine's left. And that does two things. Number one, it creates a certain respect for the medicine experience. It requires a bit of an investment and commitment because swishing medicine in your mouth for 15 minutes is not pleasant to anyone. And it's not as easy to access as just taking a pill or shooting something in your nose. So people really are, who decide to go through with this treatment are committed to the experience and we haven't had any cases of anyone abusing the oral ketamine lozenges because of the nature of how they're used, which is really great. And we do work with people who have a history of substance abuse disorders as well. So that's very exciting. And the other part of it is that we do preparation when we start the experience as well as in sessions before. But for the first half an hour or so when we meet, it's like a 2.5 hour or to 3 hour long clinical session. And we have 2 therapists present, or one psychiatrist and 1 therapist. And in some cases, 2 psychiatrists, depending on who's available. And then we, chat with you to prepare you for the experience. Then you switch the medicine. In about 15 minutes or 20 minutes after switching the medicine, you start to feel the effects come on. And then those effects then last for about 60 to 90 minutes. And then you're wearing a blindfold, there's music playing, and you're in it. And some people talk and say whatever comes up and they have the words to describe it. And other people don't have the words and they're just kind of immersed in that experience. And it's a really interesting experience because what it is, which is similar to other psychedelics, but ketamine, I think, does this particularly well, is that it helps us recognize that we have this internal narrative playing on a tape that's almost like on loop. repeat over and over and over again for as long as we can remember. And it's been on so long on repeat that we don't even realize that there's a tape playing in the background that is playing a story about that we tell ourselves about who we are and what it means to be alive, and what different things in the world mean to us, and our sense of self-worth, and all of those things are kind of encompassed in this tape based on what we were taught from children. So when people take ketamine in the right circumstances, it's almost like for a brief moment pressing pause on that tape and people recognize, oh my God, there's been a tape playing, right? And then as soon as you recognize, right, and as soon as you recognize that narrative
it's true. It's totally true.
Yeah, then you can say you realize opportunities to remodel or revise that narrative.
But I mean, I've done this kind of ketamine therapy with a part. The second part was more with hypnosis, like with basically in the first round you look into let's say new ideas about yourself, and then in the second round you integrate it into you put in a new tape, you could say. And I mean, I found it super interesting what kind of let's say new role models in the first round came up, like people from like characters from movies, from history, which I never expected to see. So which all hint to an idea that you might develop about yourself. But another interesting thing that you're researching, which I find to me is one of the most fascinating things, is the epigenetic trauma. It's always, I find, kind of not so easy to explain. So maybe you could just, because I read an interview where you explained it so well, maybe that's would be amazing if you could just explain in general what this is and how it actually contributes to a whole new idea of mental health that we're looking into now.
Absolutely. This is one of my favorite subjects also.
Okay, good.
So most people don't know what epigenetics is. So I'll just break that down.
Yeah.
So most people know what DNA is and what genetics means. And genetics is referring to the DNA, right? So it's referring to these 4 letters that represent molecules that are called, that are known as A, C's, T's, and G's, that are all bonded together in the double helix that is DNA. What's really important to know, though, is that almost every single cell in our body, except for, gametes like germ cells, eggs, and sperm, have the entirety of that DNA code in those cells, right? So our skin cells and our brain cells and our stomach lining cells all have the exact same code in them as each other. They have the whole code of the whole human being. However, the cell types like the skin and the specific parts of the brain and the gut lining and all the different cells of our body still know what kinds of cells to become and how to function, even though they have the entirety of the code of the whole body in them. And the reason for that is because of epigenetics, which means on the DNA, there are little chemical markers that tell different parts of that code, the DNA itself, to turn up or turn down expression of different proteins, which then turn into the functioning of the cell and are responsible fundamentally for the functioning of any given cell and how that cell looks and what it becomes. And so, interestingly enough, what Dr. Rachel Yehuda at Yale and Mount Sinai discovered, that people who have PTSD, contrary to the opinion at the time, had actually low cortisol, not high cortisol. And it was thought that they had high cortisol, but it turns out that it's the opposite, and nobody really understood why. But and actually denied the findings. But when she further investigated that concept, what she found was that there are markings on the DNA, these epigenetic markings that are changing on the different genes in the cortisol receptor system and the cortisol system and in other stress response proteins in the body that are impacted by trauma directly. So people who have been traumatized, and now it's been replicated causally in animals that have experienced trauma in a laboratory setting, the trauma itself is inducing changes on the DNA, really affecting the way that certain parts of our stress response genes are turned up or turned down over time. And that this is actually impacting not just what Eric Kandel found, which was the way that our neurons talk to each other and talk to other parts of the body and the strength and power of those connections, but also the way that the code itself is stored and the memory around that code is stored. And so why is that really fascinating? Well, it's particularly fascinating because when people who have had trauma have offspring, and especially when that trauma is very significant, even when those offspring are raised, and this is the same for animals, in a safe and otherwise safe environment, those people still carry or are very likely to carry the same epigenetic modifications caused by that trauma that happened to their parents or to their grandparents. And it can pass on. In laboratory studies, it's shown at least 4 generations. In humans, we don't have guaranteed safe environments. So it could be 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 generations, who knows? But the point is that what happens to us and that we do not resolve within ourselves in our lifetimes gets passed on to our children on their DNA, on their code, and actually has been found to increase or indicate or suggest a predisposition to developing PTSD or depression, which is a first observation, right? If your parents experience severe trauma, then you're more likely to develop PTSD and depression. And there's a partially environmental component to that, which is what most people thought was the majority of the component. But now it's clear through the epigenetic work that it's the environment and the genetics together, and that the epigenetic code is storing information from the environment on DNA. And so this is actually very encouraging, because if negative experiences from the environment can shift our DNA expression patterns, then positive experiences from the environment, like healing experiences and awe-inspiring experiences, may also be able to shift our expression of stress response genes. And so it gives us a whole different understanding, as you alluded to earlier, about how we can approach mental illness now by understanding that this is a whole body thing. It's not just a mental thing. It's not just mental illness, it's illness. It's all health is compromised because it goes all the way down to the DNA.
I mean, I think this book, the Body Keeps the Score, is a little bit like, but that's maybe even not with the epigenetic question, but it's still kind of in that topic, I feel. But so, and you mentioned her, Rachel Yehuda, she researches this in the context of Holocaust survivors or people who have been in a concentration camp and their families or their family trauma. And I mean, of course, now the super interesting new thing around this topic is how you can actually break the cycle with a mostly MDMA assisted psychotherapy. That's her research, I guess, at the moment, which will be,
other therapies too. Actually, it started with CBT and non-drug therapies. That was actually the first hint that these positive remodeling was happening.
Yeah.
And then MDMA is now the current study that we're doing, which is also showing promising results.
So you're researching on that too at the moment?
Yeah, so I'm actually working with MAPS and Rachel Yehuda and Dr. Rael Khan at University of Southern California and Dr. Joe Tafur of the Modern Spirit nonprofit to basically look at what is changing in the epigenetic code, particularly in stress response genes like cortisol, before and after MDMA-assisted psychotherapy with subjects from the current MAPS phase 3 FDA trial with MDMA.
Wow, okay. That's super interesting. I mean, and I think to me, honestly, when I heard this the first time, that kind of research and that kind of, let's say, topic at all. So, I mean, I think I just had read something back then about Jan Bastiaans, the Dutch psychiatrist who treated people coming straight from the concentration camp with LSD therapy. But then this kind of, he had to stop it and he had to move underground. And now, of course, the topic's coming back and people remember him. But it was kind of maybe one of the few first steps in that direction. But I mean, so to me, the most interesting thing with this, that it moves also the conversation away from strictly, let's say, political reasons, or society reasons, how, let's say, a German society could actually just think of the Holocaust once a year and then the work is done, and let's move on because it's Christmas and it's another topic. So that means that kind of epigenetic tradition also in a German trauma, and not only on the Jewish side, in terms of the aggressor, is so ingrained in this culture and in the country that if you really think about it, it's kind of impossible that it's kind of addressed properly. So I know that's a really big question, and the topic is probably just, let's say, being kind of talked about by people like you and Rachel. But how's your perspective on, let's say, the whole question around this that will affect like a whole thinking about how a society works, or how a country works, or how a country could have like every country could actually suffer from PTSD as a country or as a nation. Do you know what I mean? Or is this too abstract?
No, it's a really good question. I love the hard questions. I think that and first off, I wanted to mention that I of course forgot two people who were working on the MDMA epigenetics trial. Candace Lewis at ASU and Ben Kelmendi at Yale are also collaborators on that trial. But to get back to your question, I think that a big part of the struggle with treating or even for those of us who do not meet diagnostic criteria for PTSD, is the denial and the social narrative that we deny it systematically, then we reject the opportunity to be aware of it and to become aware of mistakes we've made in the past so that we can learn from them and grow and become stronger, better versions of ourselves, better versions of our communities, show up better for our communities at large, and also be better role models, as you were alluding to earlier, right? That we do, whether we believe it or not, are role models for others around us and influence others around us with our behavior and with the way we speak and the way we communicate. And showing up better ourselves is, of course, one of the first and most important things to making our nations and our communities better. And being supportive of each other, right? Showing up in a non-judgmental way, for instance, is critical to making sure that people understand it's okay to talk about being hurt, to talk about feeling shame and guilt, knowing that these are feelings that every human being feels, right? It's not that, even though it feels extremely personal and unique to you, it is also at the same time something that every human being on the face of the earth has felt at some point or many points in their lives. So there's no point in denying it. There's no point in rejecting it. That's just a waste of our precious human energy. Ultimately, the best thing that we can do is dive in face first, or as Milla, the famous Buddhist monk Milarepa said, throw your head in the mouth of the beast and say, "Eat me if you will." And then we'll find out sooner than we thought that beast is actually something we create in our heads, and it will disappear. Right?
Yeah, that's true. And I think, there are a couple of books about, let's say, if it comes to Germany, like that there's a certain anxiety that has been transferred from people who were in the Second World War to their grandchildren or like grandchildren. And it's interesting, before I engaged in my own psychedelic experience, I had always this underlying, like sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle anxiety for not having enough, like whatever it was, like money, food, career opportunities. And although it didn't match the reality at all, and I could never really answer why this feeling of not having enough, where it actually could come from. And obviously, people, that's what people didn't have anything after this war. And my grandfather was in the Second World War. So, and it was always about not having enough, but also just not being able to look outside your very small community and neighborhood. And for example, we had over lunch, I never talked about this, what we had after school, I went to my grandparents for lunch. And I think every second lunch, I asked them if they had known something about Auschwitz. And they said, well, later on. So, and it was okay. Of course, you could say, well, there wasn't the internet at that time, but I mean, still, I kept asking that question. They didn't have an answer to this. So, and I thought that was so interesting, that why did we talk about Auschwitz over lunch, which I realize now because I was 12 years old. And then until Chernobyl happened, you talked about Chernobyl from that point on. But then we came back to Auschwitz, actually, to that conversation. And back then, I didn't realize why I kept asking them, because there was obviously something in the air that was not really addressed whatsoever. So, and I think what I really think about a lot in terms of the psychedelic topic now is like, it seems that there's, and you talk about this too, like re-traumatizing element is something also very strong that's coming out in people's, let's say, healing or recovery in psychedelic experiences. So that you suddenly have moments, for example, a lot of Germans, including myself, go on a psilocybin trip. And the first thing, again, they see, that happened to me, like I had a long conversation with a rabbi in Auschwitz. A friend of mine was like, well, I was in the Russian front as a soldier because my grandfather was there. So, I mean, I'm not saying this is strictly re-traumatizing, but it brings something back to you that you obviously have to maybe address in a way.
Yeah.
I'd love to know,
Yeah.
what is your take on re-traumatization, and how and why is it maybe something good for a quick second?
I mean, it's a really great question, and I'm really glad you asked it, because I think it's rare that people like us get to have sort of this kind of conversation candidly, because it's a hard conversation to have, and it's obviously painful for many, many people on all sides. And I think that there are a couple different ways to look at it. To the point you were making earlier, the mechanism of how we change, how we heal, and how we transform and overcome trauma and grow from it is starting to become known, and it's starting to become more understood on a basic scientific level, which is really exciting, because it's starting to help us, as you know, destigmatize a lot of the connotation and the views that have been passed on for generations about psychedelic experiences and about trauma and healing experiences themselves. It's not just a suck it up type of situation. The suck it up mentality will get you over very small challenges, but when you're facing real big challenges, it's not going to do the trick. People need support. They need to feel safe. They need love and affection and compassion and to heal. And these are the emotional healing tools that are critical, that we all can give to each other for free. And I think that there's a really interesting, situation where when we talk about psychedelic medicines, a lot of people perceive, based on the understanding of these medicines, that they're all good or they're all bad, right? And then there's a group in the middle that understands the fine points of they can be good and they can be unpleasant depending on your situation. To that point, the whole way that psychedelic medicines work is they're really non-specific amplifiers, right? So they amplify everything. They don't just amplify joy. They amplify everything. And psychedelic actually means to show the mind, right? Psyche means mind. Delos means to show. So what we're talking about is taking a medicine, or in the most common way that we experience psychedelic states, which is not medicine induced at all, would be through dreams or meditation. It's a very similar kind of experience where, depending on how much you lean into it, that you are having the filter between your conscious ego self, the part of you that's typically driving your person and your attention, that's awake and active most of the day. That part of you kind of takes a back seat for a little while. That internal narrative about who you are and how you see yourself in the world is paused for a brief moment, and you're able to then sort of shine a spotlight at yourself and look what's beneath the surface, right? So if you imagine that the amount of stuff we know is like an iceberg, that little bit that's sticking out of the water that you see is our consciousness. That's what we're aware of. And then the rest of that iceberg, which could be 90% plus of that iceberg, is everything we know about ourselves and the world that is not within our awareness. So when you take a medicine like a psychedelic medicine, or you enter into a deep, long meditative state or trance, or even, through dreaming, what happens is that we now become aware for a certain amount of time of all of that stuff beneath the surface. And then that creates an opportunity, when it's done in a respectful and, thoughtful way, where you set an intention and you've done some preparation and some integration planned around the experience, that you can just lean in and feel safe to evaluate what's down there. And then whether it's a hurt part of yourself, or an ashamed part of yourself, or a guilty part of yourself, or an angry part, or a sad part, or it's a happy or joyful or ecstatic, excited part, or inspired part. The point is, all of those parts exist simultaneously. And so when you're taking a psychedelic medicine, any of them can come up depending on what intention you bring into your experience. If you bring in a disorganized, not well thought out intention, then or your intention is to escape from yourself, chances are something unpredictable is going to come up, and it may not be something that you're particularly excited to address in that moment. Yeah. However, those same experiences, when there is a little intention behind the healing process, even if it's something as simple as expressing gratitude for yourself for getting to this experience, taking this time, and expressing gratitude for anything that comes up, is one way that reframes the experience to turn that potentially unpleasant thing or shameful feeling that comes up in you during an experience into an opportunity for growth and radical transformation that can be, life-changing. And so, yes, you can absolutely re-traumatize yourself. I've known people who have done this through Vipassana retreats, though. It's right. Not necessarily something that's just around psychedelics. It is possible to re-traumatize yourself when these tools are not used carefully.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting you bring up Vipassana. I always feel like I'm kind of, in the end, I'm too scared to do it. And I also don't know if I could follow up with
It's a serious commitment.
It is a super serious commitment, yeah. But would you agree that psychedelics help you to find the person that you are without the trauma that you experienced? Is that like the very short version, maybe, what they do for you?
So that's one way to describe it. Yeah. I think the way that I would describe it, there's like infinite ways to describe these experiences. Yeah. But one of the ways I would add onto that is, it's almost like child's eyes, right? So it's this term that we use for looking at yourself and looking at the world again through the eyes of you as a child, prior to all of the stuff that you learned about how the world is a dangerous, unsafe, or a cruel, unjust place, right? Yeah. And all of a sudden, when you're able to look at yourself again through those eyes and from that perspective, regardless of what age you remember yourself being the last time you looked at yourself in the world through that perspective, it helps us remember that that's a perspective that we always have access to, right? The medicine is just a catalyst. It just facilitates access to a perspective or to a state of mind. It's not the source of how we get there. It's a tool that can be used to teach us and remind us that this is a state that we have access to if we remember that it exists and remember what it feels like and how to get there. And that simply by practicing the integration tools like self-gratitude, self-forgiveness, self-compassion, self-love is one example on a daily basis, we can actually shift that perspective and that perception of the world to one that is more consistent with who we actually know ourselves to be, which is, as you said, the version of ourselves that existed pre-trauma, right? And that the trauma happened and that it's an experience that modified how we see ourselves in the world, but it's not part of us, right? It's not an actual part of our identity. That's the biggest misconception that people who have experienced trauma have, is that the trauma is part of them. And it's not. It's, it's something that modifies your experience that we can use as a tool for growth as much as we can use as a tool to hold us back.
Well, that's a great last words, I would say, like what exactly psychedelics are doing for us. Thank you so much, Dave, for being on the show. I'm excited already for the next psychedelic news hour.
Thank you so much for having me, and I really appreciate it. And always a pleasure to have this conversation.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the New Health Club Show, and please follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or if you would like to sign up for our newsletter, please go to www.thenewhealthclub.de and subscribe to the newsletter. Again, please follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Clubhouse, of course. There's also a New Health Club now. Or even better, sign up to our newsletter on thenewhealthclub.de. I talk to you very soon.